Central Nervous System Lecture. This lecture we will identify the major anatomical components of the brain and spinal cord, their functions, and brain disorders. We will also talk about and identify the coverings and fluid spaces of the brain and spinal cord. The central nervous system consists of four major components. There is the brainstem, the cerebellum, the diencephalon, and the cerebrum. First, we will talk about the brainstem. The brainstem has three major parts: the medulla oblongata, the pons, and the midbrain. The brainstem consists of white matter with bits of gray matter scattered throughout it. Here's a picture of the nervous system. In the green, we have the central nervous system, which consists of the brain and the spinal cord. In the yellow, we have the peripheral nervous system, which consists of all other nerves within the body. Here's a picture of the major regions of the central nervous system. So within the brain, we have the spinal cord down here in the yellow, and then we have the midbrain components directly above it, which consists of the medulla, the pons, and the midbrain. From there, directly above that, we have the hypothalamus and the thalamus, which is directly above that. We also have the pineal gland, which is very close here and mainly is responsible for melatonin production and our sleep habits. We also have in the orange here, we have the cerebrum or the cerebral cortex. The skull is the outer shell, and in the blue here we have the cerebellum. The brainstem, its functions, all three parts of the brainstem are a two-way conduction path. The sensory tracts of the brainstem conduct impulses to higher parts of the brain. Motor tracts conduct from the higher parts of the brain to the spinal cord. Gray matter areas in the brainstem function as important reflex centers. The midbrain also consists of what we call the vital centers, which is responsible for the cardiac, respirations, and vasomotor functions. The cerebellum is the second largest part of the brain. It consists of folded gray matter that composes a thin outer layer forming a large surface area for nervous conduction, allowing huge information processing here. It helps control muscle contractions, and recent evidence shows the coordinating effects of the cerebellum may be more extensive in assisting the cerebrum in other regions of the brain. White matter inside the cerebellum branches into a tree-like pattern, which is called the arba veda. The central nervous system also has a diencephalon, which consists of the hypothalamus, thalamus, and pineal gland. The structure and function of the hypothalamus consists mainly of the posterior pituitary gland, pituitary stalk, and gray matter. It acts as a major center of controlling the autonomic nervous system, therefore helps controlling the function of internal organs. It also controls hormone secretion such as antidiuretic hormones and aids in H2O or water secretion and retention. It indirectly helps control hormone secretion by most other endocrine glands and contains a center for controlling appetite, wakefulness, pleasure, and also temperature. The structure and function of the thalamus. The thalamus is a dumbbell-shaped mass of gray matter extending toward each cerebral hemisphere. It relays sensory impulses to cerebral cortex sensory areas. In some ways, it produces emotions of pleasantness and unpleasantness associated with sensation. It plays a part in the arousal or alerting mechanisms also. The cerebrum is the largest part of the human brain. The outer layer of gray matter is the cerebral cortex made up of lobes. There are 4 main lobes. The frontal lobe is responsible for emotions, personality, morality, intellect, and speech. The parietal lobe is responsible for sensory, motor, pain, heat, and touch. Temporal lobe is responsible for hearing, and the occipital lobe is responsible for vision. It is mainly composed of dendrites and cell bodies of neurons, and the interior of the cerebrum is composed mainly of white matter, that is, nerve fibers arranged in bundles called tracts. The function of the cerebrum is for mental processes of all types, including sensation, consciousness, memory, and voluntary control of movements. So here is a picture of the cerebrum anatomy. So the frontal lobe is in the front. Directly behind that is the parietal lobe. The occipital lobe is in the back of the skull, and the temporal lobe is below all 3 of these, but above the cerebellum. The spinal cord consists of columns of white matter composed of bundles of myelinated nerve fibers that form the outer portion of the H-shaped core of the spinal cord. Bundles of axons are called tracts, and the interior composed of gray matter made up of mainly neuron dendrites and cell bodies. The spinal cord functions as the primary center of all spinal cord reflexes. The spinal cord is about 17 to 18 inches long, and it lies inside the spinal column. The spinal column is used for protection. The spinal cord consists of 31 pairs of spinal nerves, and we talk about these spinal nerves a little bit more in the peripheral nervous system lecture. Here's a cross-section of the spinal cord, and as you can see here, there is gray matter in the middle, which is in an H shape and is surrounded by the white matter pathways or nerve tracts, and then it attaches to the spinal roots, as you can see here. Coverings of fluid spaces and the brain and the spinal cord. Nervous tissue needs to be protected, so the brain and the spinal cord are surrounded by rough fluid-containing membranes called meninges. The meninges are surrounded by bones such as the cranial bone and vertebrae. The spinal meninges have 3 layers: the dura mater, the arachnoid mater, and the pia mater. The cerebrospinal meninges. The arachnoid mater have a cog-like, web-like middle and is the middle layer. The dura mater is the outside membrane, and the pia mater is the inner layer that adheres to the central nervous system tissue. There are several different fluid spaces within the brain and spinal cord. The subarachnoid space of the meninges, the central canal inside the cord, the ventricles of the brain, and all the fluid in the cerebrospinal fluid. The fluid is called cerebrospinal fluid, or CSF. So here's a picture of the spinal coverings. So you have the dura mater on the outside here, the arachnoid mater, which is inside the dura mater, and the pia mater, which attaches to the spinal cord or spinal root. All 3 of these are then surrounded by the spinal column for protection. Fluid spaces in the brain. Here is a picture of the ventricles and the fluid that moves throughout them. Fluid spaces are between the pia mater and the arachnoid matter in the brain and the spinal cord. It also fills spaces in the brain called cerebral ventricles. The flow of cerebrospinal fluid. The fluid produced by filtration of blood by the choroid plexus of each ventricle flows inferior through the lateral ventricles, interventricular foramen, and the third ventricle. Also the cerebral aqueduct, fourth ventricle, and the subarachnoid space, and then to the blood, as you can see here.